Good morning.
Your name is please.
Larissa Panieri-Peter.
Do you have any objection to taking the oath?
I don't.
Do you swear that the evidence you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
So help me God.
Well, lady, good morning. May I just place on record that I did receive a report from this witness last Wednesday morning in the court proceedings. I had an opportunity to properly look at this report, 43 pages long, on Friday, and I tried to make contact with my learned friend. Unfortunately, I could not reach him. I did, over the weekend, drafted legal and factual arguments objecting to that admissibility of this report as evidence, not so much what this witness is going to say, viva voce, and I've provided my learned friend this morning with a copy of my arguments. This report does not contain, as an attachment, a curriculum vitae of this witness, nor does it contain any documents and or statements that are referred to in this report. Maybe we should proceed, the court so pleases, to hear this expert's curriculum vitae, and then from there, if I may allow my objections to be raised on the merits of her evidence.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady. I would like to put certain things on record. Part of the mandate given to Dr. Larissa Panieri-Peter, who is, for the record, a registered and practicing medical practitioner, a registered and practicing specialist psychiatrist, and a registered and practicing forensic psychiatrist. Part of the mandate given to her was to comment on certain aspects relating to the accused. In her opinion, and in terms of the methodology adopted by her, she needed access to his evidence in chief and under cross-examination in court before she could finalize her report. And as we know, the testimony of Mr. Rohde continued until, I think it was Tuesday last week. I think we had his testimony for about half an hour on Tuesday last week. Immediately following upon that, there was a problem in obtaining the transcript of his evidence, which we actually still have not got. But fortunately, Dr. Panieri-Peter was able to watch him on live streaming in terms of his testimony on a Monday, and I was able to fill her in on the final cross-examination on the Tuesday by way of a consultation, and as the court knows, there was no re-examination. Against that background, she finalized her report within 24 hours of Mr. Rohde having concluded his testimony. I think by any measure that was an exceptionally speedy finalization. The minute it was finalized, I sent a copy to Mr. Finnegan, my learned friend. And when we discussed this matter with the court in chambers last week, he had already received it. That is a matter of record. And he was given Dr. Panieri's full report. She obviously has a file on this matter because part of her modus operandi involved checking through documentation, perusing the South African police docket, interviewing collateral sources. In fact, she has a huge file on this matter.
What is, sorry, her mandate is an indication of on the accused, not the deceased.
On
What
both.
was her mandate?
On both.
Well, that's not what you said when you started this.
That was part of the mandate.
No, you said that it was in relation to the accused.
Part of her mandate was in relation to the accused, and she was not able to finalize her report until she had seen or until the accused had finalized his testimony.
Okay. Well, so this expert did some investigation then.
Not
Is that
some,
right?
did an enormous amount of
Well,
investigation.
it was investigation. Is that, I'm trying to ascertain what her role is. I never got that report.
I know, my lady, I was on the point of handing it in
Okay.
today in the course of her testimony.
Okay, I'm trying to understand what your representations are.
My lady, if I may continue, she was instructed to assess Mr. Rohde. She was also instructed to conduct a retrospective psychiatric assessment of the deceased. So that there is no doubt in this regard, I place the following on record. Mr. Rohde was referred to Dr. Panieri-Peter for independent psychiatric assessment evaluation during September 2016. The nature and purpose thereof was to conduct a broad forensic psychiatric assessment as well as to comment specifically on any findings that might or might not, in forensic psychiatry terms, be congruent or incongruent with an intimate partner homicide. In addition, Dr. Panieri-Peter was requested to conduct a retrospective independent psychiatric assessment, in brackets a so-called psychological autopsy of the deceased Mrs. Rohde in terms of her known history. Dr. Panieri-Peter was also specifically requested to comment on any features pertaining to Mrs. Rohde that might or might not, in forensic psychiatric terms, be congruent or incongruent with suicide. That was her mandate.
Thank you.
Now, her report was completed last week, and at the earliest possible opportunity, a copy thereof was given to my learned friend. My learned friend says that he attempted to contact me and left messages for me on Friday. I know of no such messages. No such message is recorded at my chambers, and there is no such message on any of my mobile phones. That is a fact. The normal method in which my learned friend and I have communicated over the past months has been by email, and no email was sent to me. The first that I heard that there was any form of objection was 10 minutes before the trial started today. And that is what I, with respect, regard as an approach akin to trial by ambush. I don't think it is acceptable, and I don't think it's necessary. At the very least, my learned friend could have sent me an email if he couldn't speak to me on Friday to say, I intend to object to the report. But the problem that I have is, he has now gone on record, he's prepared heads of argument in this regard, and we haven't heard a word yet from the expert. We don't know whether she is an expert. That will depend on the evidence that's led in terms of her qualifications, her experience, her skills, her knowledge, and all the related factors. Secondly, it is my respectful submission that it is for the court to decide at the end of the day what weight to place on any evidence from this witness, taking into account her testimony, the contents of her report, any objections that my learned friend might have, and any response that I might have to those objections. I believe that Dr. Panieri-Peter has a file in this matter that is something in the vicinity of 300 to 400 pages long. That is her file in terms of all the information that she's gathered and the assessments that she's conducted. I have here available her curriculum vitae, which it was my intention to hand up as the first document. I have here her report, which was my intention to hand up as the second document. She has kindly also prepared in respect of that report a type of summary or index for the assistance of the court. And then on top of all of that, there are certain authorities to which she would like to refer, and will no doubt do so. I'm talking now about medical authorities in the field of psychiatry, and in particular forensic psychiatry, and that she will refer to in the course of her testimony. Now, my proposal is, with respect, that I be allowed to proceed with this witness, and that the appropriate time to argue regarding the admissibility or otherwise of any aspects of her opinion will be when the case is concluded and we argue the merits of the matter. So with the leave of the court, may I please proceed?
Thank you. Can we just hear from Mr. Panieri? Are you consistent that you wish to raise objections now?
I will raise the objection on the merits of the matter, on evidence as it is produced, or she wants to rely on what I would submit hearsay evidence, documents that I have not seen. We can deal with that.
Well, that's very different to saying you don't want this witness to testify. It's the defence's right to call whosoever they wish to call, and we've been informed, I've been informed that this witness was coming to testify when, as early as Wednesday, when you were in my chambers. I'm very keen to hear what this witness has to say, and I will decide ultimately what way to attach to the evidence of this witness. You're very welcome, as would be your right, to raise objections as we go along.
That's indeed my position. I never said she could not enter the witness stand.
Well, it most certainly sounded perhaps to both myself and Mr. Panieri like that, but very well, let's get on with the evidence for today. Mr. Panieri, your witness.
Thank you, Melanie. Good morning, Dr. Panieri-Peter.
Good morning.
And thank you for being here. I want to show you a document which, of course, you prepared, I believe. Your abbreviated, your abbreviated curriculum vitae.
Okay.
You confirm this document and the correctness of the contents thereof.
I do.
Now I want to turn to the second page of this document. In fact, I want you to, sorry, I'm going to go back to the first page. Under professional qualifications, I see that we have in the second paragraph that the degree of Bachelor of Medicine and Bachelor of Surgery, commonly known at UCT, at any rate as MBCHB, was conferred upon you by the University of Cape Town in 1994, following upon your studies as a medical student.
That is correct.
Were you struggling to hear you?
Sorry, my name.
Don't worry about the microphone.
Okay.
It's not amplifying your voice. It's just recording.
I'll talk louder.
Thank you. When did you, just for the sake of completeness, complete your matriculation year?
In 1988.
Right. Now I note that this MBCHB degree was awarded with first class honours, which is the sort of UCT equivalent of the cum laude degree. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that you were awarded various distinctions and medals, in particular the Psychiatry Medal in 1993, awarded annually to the best candidate of the UCT undergraduate medical class.
Yes.
And 10 academic scholarships and 2 other subject medals.
Yes.
Then, following upon that, you completed a year of internship, I understand, at Groote Schuur Hospital. In other words, your housemanship year. And at the end of 1995, maybe the beginning of 1996, you were registered for the first time as a medical practitioner by the then South African Medical and Dental Council. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now known as the Health Professions Council of South Africa. Now, following upon your registration as a medical practitioner, you spent a period, if I'm not mistaken, in private practice in the Atlantis Melkbosstrand area as a GP, as a general medical practitioner.
Yes, I worked for another person's practice. It was really a form of locum that I worked with.
Right. And then you accepted a post as a senior house officer in the Department of Neurology at Groote Schuur Hospital with effect from July 1996. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'm referring now to the bottom of page 2, and that post you held for 6 months, after which you were offered and accepted a post as a registrar, in other words, as a specialist in training in the Department of Neurosurgery at UCT and its Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences. And your post was actually at the Red Cross War Memorial Children's Hospital Trauma Unit.
Yes, my lady, I worked in the front room of the Children's Hospital for a year.
And that post you held from January 1997 for the whole year until December 1997. Is that correct?
Yes.
Then you were offered and accepted a post as a registrar in the Department of Psychiatry at the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences of the University of Cape Town, and also at all the psychiatric complex of hospitals, not so?
That's correct.
And that post you held, in other words, this was your specialization period from February 1998 to January 2002. That's that 4-year period, or is it a 5-year period? 4-year period. And you rotated in that time at Valkenburg, Lentegeur, Groote Schuur hospitals, as well as the Child and Family Unit of Red Cross.
Yes. There also were community clinics and various other places that the rotation takes you through through a range of hospitals in the Western Cape.
All in the field of psychiatry.
Yes, that's correct.
And following upon that, you had the fellowship of the College of Psychiatrists of the Colleges of Medicine of South Africa conferred upon you in 2001.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
And that is a specialist academic qualification to enable you, once you've done your period of time as a registrar, to be registered by the council and to practice as a specialist psychiatrist.
Yes.
Okay. Now I noticed that in that time you were the Novartis Gold Medal winner for the best student nationally, that's in Southern Africa, in the primary psychiatry special examinations, and you also were the Linus Medal winner in 1999 of the best candidate nationally. I've got them the wrong way around, in the final exam. So you won the best candidate in both exams.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, in addition to all of that, in 2014, you were certified as an independent medical examiner by the American Board of Independent Medical Examiners, and you confirmed that.
Yes.
And then, by dint of your experience, knowledge, training, and track record, you were approved by the Health Professions Council to be registered in the subspeciality of forensic psychiatry, and in fact that was in 2014 and you were so registered.
Yes, my lady, I worked as a in forensic psychiatry actually from 2002, but the subspecialty per se in the Health Professions Council actually didn't exist until 2012. This was a formalization process. So what happens with that is that they recognize that some people have to have had the experience beforehand. You have to show and prove that. And it's actually in terms of what's called the grandfather clause, which is slightly disconcerting, but that is the clause under which one is then conferred that if one isn't a new trainee in that specialty. And so that's why it was only in 2014, because it actually only existed then. Yes.
Thank you. Now let's go back to your CV, page 2 of it, and just get on record the work experience that you have. One thing I forgot to mention was that in your internship here, you rotated through obstetrics, surgery, and medicine at Grooteskies Hospital.
That's correct.
Right. Now, you were appointed, first of all, as a specialist psychiatrist, and in other words, a consultant at Valkenburg Hospital upon your qualifying and being registered as a specialist. Is that so?
Yes. There was a short period before that where I had a research post at the Medical Research
Sorry,
Council.
are we struggling to hear you here?
Sorry, I'll talk louder again. I've got a little bit of a frog in my throat. I think so. There was a period of about 6 months, my lady, where I did some research at the Medical Research Council in forensic psychiatry, but then I did get that post in middle of 2002, where I started working in Valkenburg as a specialist in the forensic unit.
Thank you. Sorry, doctor, would you like some water?
I think that would help me.
Oh.
Thank you so much. It's a little bit croaky, I'm sorry.
Are you well enough to carry on?
Yes, 100%. It's just, I think I talk too much sometimes.
Right. Now, after a period, you were promoted in the government service to the post of senior specialist, in other words, senior consultant, as it's referred to in the government service, specialist psychiatrist.
That's correct.
Also based at Valkenburg Hospital.
Yes, in the forensic unit there.
Now let's go to page 2 and just look at what is written in your CV in the middle section, where it says specialist and senior specialist psychiatrist, Valkenburg Hospital Forensic Unit, one of two psychiatrists, for the most part responsible for all forensic assessments referred to by the courts of the Western and Northern Cape in terms of sections 77, 78 and 79 of the Criminal Procedure Act, fitness to stand trial, criminal capacity and other psychiatric issues relating to the charges were assessed. Responsibility involved assessment of awaiting trial offenders, clinical assessment of risk, writing of reports, giving expert testimony to the regional magistrates and high courts in criminal matters in which judgments, including those by the Supreme Court of Appeal, made reference to the testimony provided. Sample high-profile cases to have included were State versus Taste, State versus Peterson, and State versus Van der Vest. Also responsible for the management, treatment, and rehabilitation of state patients, both inpatient and outpatient, in the maximum, medium, and minimum secure units at Falkenberg Hospital and in the community. And then responsible for management of 2 medium-stay units from 2002 to 2009, and also the maximum secure unit from 2005 to 2009, i.e. 3 of the 4 forensic units at Falkenberg. Now you left government service and went into independent private practice as a specialist psychiatrist with effect from March 2009. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And if we turn to page 1, we see the following.
Thank you, my lady.
We see the following at the bottom of page 1, where it says medical and forensic experience. Psycholegal assessments on a spectrum of both civil and criminal cases, including but not limited to 1, the determination of mental state at the time of the offence, 2, psychiatric or psychological influences on the criminal or civil matter at hand, psychiatric factors motivating or determining behaviour and current functioning. I'm not going to read the others because they follow from this, but include in that, of course, determination of criminal capacity, testamentary capacity, etc., etc., etc. Now, if we look at the next page, cases have involved inter alia a range of matters, including criminal prosecutions in the courts of South Africa and international courts, arbitration hearings, appointments onto the panel in terms of the Criminal Procedure Act, medical inquests, civil litigation in the High Court, and professional conduct inquiries and other inquiries of the Health Professions Council of South Africa. And we have there, if we haven't looked at it before, sample high-profile cases have included State versus Letsuwania, State versus Paulson, State versus Extian, State versus Steenkamp, stuff. And you say that most of your cases are not cited for reasons of confidentiality. Is there anything that you want to add to that? I see that the last item there, inter alia, conducting disability assessments in your capacity as a certified independent examiner by the American Board. Anything you want to add to that?
No, my lady, I think that's...
Right, let's go to page 3 then. Inter alia, you have been involved in the teaching and training of psychiatry to undergraduate medical students in the MDCHB program of the University of Cape Town. And you were part of the committee coordinating this teaching, and you were actively involved in the teaching and training of postgraduate students and registrars in psychiatry, forensic psychiatry, and psychology as a lecturer and then later as a senior lecturer. And then, of course, I see from the 2009 to the present, you've been actively involved in seminars, lectures, workshops conducted in private practice together with providing an advisory role to other colleagues about forensic issues encountered in their legal and clinical practices. Okay? That's correct. Now you've been involved in certain publications. They include, I take it that you are the L. Panieri-Peter referred to in these 3 publications: the effects of alcohol and substances, number 2, domestic violence, and 3, a publication of yours, Profile of a Rapist. Then you have been involved in a host of lectures which you have provided or delivered by invitation, and they range from cybersexuality to forensic psychiatry in South Africa, interspousal abuse in South Africa, and narcissism and clinical practice.
Yes.
Let's look at the next page of your CV. I see there you have, right at the top, a lecture which you provided on stalking and stalkers, another one on diagnosis in psychiatry, another one on domestic violence, killing our partners, the South African epidemic, and then your professional memberships are listed there. Are you also a member of the Medical Association of South Africa, or SAMA as it's now called?
It forms a subsection of some of those other memberships.
Okay. But in any event, you are an active member of the South African Society of Psychiatrists, the Private Practice Management Group, the American Academy of Psychiatry and the Law, and the American Board of Independent Examiners. And we have there your referees, who are Professor Robertson and Professor Ashford. Now, taking all of that into account, taking into account your knowledge, skill, and qualifications, as well as your experience, is it fair to say whether you are an expert in the field of psychiatry, and in particular forensic psychiatry? Can you comment on that?
I am a psychiatrist and a forensic psychiatrist with considerable experience. I think the court will determine whether it accepts or not accepts my testimony on that basis.
Thank you. Now, when I addressed the court earlier, I referred to the mandate that has been given to you, and I think you heard me say that the mandate that was given to you was in the following terms. And I'm going to quickly go through that. Mr. Rohde was referred to you for independent psychiatric evaluation during September 2016. Is that correct?
Yes.
The nature and purpose thereof was to conduct a broad forensic psychiatric assessment, as well as to comment specifically on any findings that might or might not, in forensic psychiatric terms, be congruent or incongruent with an intimate partner homicide. In addition, you were requested to conduct a retrospective independent psychiatric assessment, in other words, a so-called psychological autopsy of the deceased Mrs. Rohde in terms of her known history. You were also specifically requested to comment on any features pertaining to Mrs. Rohde that might or might not, in forensic psychiatric terms, be congruent or incongruent with suicide. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Right. Now, the methodology that you adopted, we can deal with that when we get to your report. Before we do that, my lady, may I request that Dr. Panieri's abbreviated curriculum vitae be handed in as exhibit N for Nancy 1. Triple N.
Thank you. So marked. 1.
1, as the court pleases. Now, Dr. Panieri-Peter, we know that you prepared a report of your findings, opinions, evaluations, and recommendations, and that this was disseminated to my learned friend. It was finalized on the 6th of June and sent to him by email on the same day. Is that correct, as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware. I
Right.
sent it to you on that date, and I've been told that you sent it to him.
Right. And I have the report here. You your copy there in front of you?
I do.
And do you confirm this report as yours?
I do.
Thank you. My lady, may I request that this be handed up, exhibit, and marked exhibit triple N2, please.
Thank you. So marked.
You have, in addition, in order to assist the learned court, because it's a lengthy report and it's going to take us time to work through it, you have prepared a summary of the main points emanating from this report. And I have here that summary dated the 10th of June 2018. Can I just show it to you, and if you would confirm that this is in fact the summary that you prepared.
Okay.
My lady, if I might say, I didn't have a very good word for the term summary because it's more like a table of contents stroke summary. I think it would be better to say it's sort of like somewhere between those two. It's mostly a table of contents.
Right.
Headings,
well,
as it were.
the point is it's an aid to,
Yes.
to your report.
To sort of try and keep the court's bearings. And
Thank you. Would you
May
like
I
this to
have
be
that up as exhibit triple N3, please, my lady?
so marked? Thank you.
And we're going to work through your report, and I'm going to keep on my side my finger on the summary or table of content, whatever you want to call it. So what I envisage doing is, between you and me and the frog in your throat, sharing, reading your report, and then asking you to comment on various things as we go along. The report is lengthy and it is going to take some time, and it's 43 pages long. But if we can start at the beginning, and maybe you can start by reading the first few paragraphs.
may I ask a question?
Please, of course.
Do you want me to read it and then comment, or would you like me to, for example, the first two paragraphs have actually been put already
I think
into
let's
the
start
court?
at the beginning and work through the report. Would you follow my line of questioning?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. My lady, if I go too fast, which I'm often accused of doing, please could you just indicate to me? And I also apologize because I haven't been wearing glasses for very long, and I've put them on my head, and I've been told that that is a sign of disrespect in the court. I don't
Not at
intend
all.
it as so at all. So,
Thank you. Not a problem.
Thanks.
Proceed.
Mr. Jason Rohde was sent to me for independent psychiatric evaluation in September 2016, the nature and purpose of the assessment being to conduct a broad forensic psychiatric assessment, as well as to specifically comment on findings that may or may not be congruent with an intimate partner homicide. I was also asked to conduct a retrospective independent psychiatric assessment or psychological autopsy of the deceased, Mrs. Susan Rohde, in terms of her known history, as well as to comment specifically on features that may or may not, in psychiatric terms, be congruent or incongruent with suicide. My lady, at this point, I want to pause on the term psychological autopsy. I've made a reference, a bundle of some references. I've tried to keep them very limited, and there are many other references that I have that, should the court wish them, I can get them. Particularly, but I just don't want to create a mountain of paperwork.
Volume. Yes.
So, yes. So, on the topic of psychological autopsy, I haven't included an article, but there is a wealth of scientific literature. Essentially, what that concept means, because I think it's very important to focus on that. It is that it is accepted that when someone is dead, you can't talk to them. Particularly in the arena of mental health, that unfortunately happens in the issue of suicide. So one of the things that I will talk about later, but is all the factors, the constellation of factors that occur that lead someone to commit suicide. But obviously, as mental health professionals, we need to try and understand why people get to the point that they kill themselves. So there has been a wealth of literature and investigation done into that has helped us understand what some of the factors are, ideally so that we can prevent that, or try to prevent that as mental health care professionals. So the method that is used is what's called a psychological autopsy. It's a terrible word, but essentially what it means is to try and gather as much information from other people that knew the deceased in order to try and work out essentially what was happening that led up to that moment.
That led up to the moment that the
Of their
person
death. Of their
committed
death,
suicide.
Committed suicide, exactly. My lady, so it is accepted, there's a wealth of body that accepts it as a method. The SCA has also accepted it as a method, used it before. But there are criticisms of that method. And the criticisms are that they arise in two folds. Academics like to make criticism about everything. There's no thing in science that isn't academically criticized.
Larissa Panieri-Peter, I wonder if you could speak a little bit louder and a little bit more slowly.
Sure. Sorry. So the one thing is that it's obviously not a good idea to just get information from one person. So one of the criticisms is if you just get information from one person, that can obviously be biased, especially in the issue of suicide, because sometimes that person is the closest person to them. And obviously, suicide is such a devastating experience for families that it can lead them to sometimes not always remember things or say things in a way that is helpful to science. And so there are criticisms in that regard. But for the most part, I would say that it is accepted as the gold standard of the way in which one does it. And those that criticize it propose that the way to resolve the difficulties is to try and gather as much information as is possible from as many different people as possible, as close to the time as is possible. Those are the three things. As much information from as many people closest to the time. So that's what I've tried to do, my lady, within what is practical.
Thank you.
Inter alia, the method of assessment included extensive psychiatric interviews with Mr. Jason Rohde, 1st of September 2016 for 6.5 hours, 9th of September 2016 for 7 hours, 6th of September 2017, that's a year later, for 3 hours, 30th of January 2018 for 2 hours. These interviews were all conducted in my office, which is here in Cape Town, and 1.5 hours of that in 2018 was actually in the presence of his psychiatrist, in the offices of the psychiatrist. I also interviewed
It's called a K?
yes, my lady, the daughter of the deceased.
Eldest, middle, youngest?
The eldest.
Thank you.
The eldest. On the 11th of September, in her home, her father was not present and he was in Cape Town at the time, and that interview was for 3.5 hours. I also interviewed, and I'm not saying each of these people's names, but I have their names, Ms. M.M., the housekeeper of the deceased, who had been their housekeeper for 14 years, on the 11th of September for 2 hours, also in Johannesburg. I'll leave it like that, friend of both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde on the 11th of September for 2 hours. He had known the accused for 12 years, and his wife was one of the deceased's closest friends. Other letters that are there, a friend of Mr. and Mrs. Rohde on the 11th of September for 2 hours. And he had been a friend of Mr. Rohde from the age of 13 and had known the deceased for the entire duration of the time that they had been married. Mr. T.C., sorry, I didn't mean to give the initials, friend of Mr. and Mrs. Rohde on the 12th of September for 2.5 hours. He had met and known the accused for 20 years and had been friends and worked with him for 8. Miss, I don't think it matters to say her name, she's a professional, Miss Suzanne Long. She's the clinical psychologist of the accused. And I interviewed her on the 12th of September 2016 for 2 hours. What is important to say at this point is that Ms. Suzanne Long, the accused clinical psychologist, had consulted with him on 10 occasions, according to her notes. And what is also significant is that she herself had had an individual session with the deceased in March of 2016 on her own. The other person I interviewed was Ms. Carol Nader, the marriage counselor of both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde, on the 12th of September for 3 hours. She had consulted with both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde on multiple occasions. They usually met on a Monday. My lady, this is another point. I had a telephonic discussion with Miss Jane Newcomb, Mrs. Jane Newcomb. She is the clinical psychologist of the deceased. And I actually spoke to her on the 22nd of August. I spoke to her before I met Jason Rohde. The reason that I contacted her is that I had been contacted, and it was actually before Mr. Rohde was arrested, because I was asked by that legal team at that point to start a process of psychological autopsy. And in fact, they said to me, would I like to meet Mr. Rohde? And I said, no, I don't want to meet him. I want to speak to everyone else that knew Mrs. Rohde. I want to speak to them first. So in fact, I had read the report or document of Ms. Carol Nader. And in fact, I put a phone call into Ms. Newcomb, and she called me back, and she said that she'd contacted her ethics committee, who said that she shouldn't put a report forward at that time. But nonetheless, she and I had a conversation for about 15 minutes, after which I took detailed notes of what she said so that I didn't forget them. And she did give me, without giving me the whole story, she gave me a very considerable amount of information in that 15-minute time. And she put her view to me very clearly. So I had that clearly before I started the process. I've also had discussions with Dr. Kevin Stolliff, who is Mr. Rohde's specialist treating psychiatrist. A range of issues were canvassed from collateral sources of information. And when I spoke to, sorry, I'll read it and then I'll explain. Persons interviewed were asked to discuss their observations of both parties over the many years, and then over the past year. They were also asked to discuss the strengths and weaknesses of both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde as they knew them. Specific and focused questions were only asked at the end of the interviews, directed towards certain psychiatric issues. Great effort was made, my lady, not to lead any of these interviewees. And it was explained to all that there was no right or wrong answers. I was simply looking for their perspectives and observations. There was not one collateral person interviewed who I considered to be attempting to provide a biased perspective to me. Each one of them appeared, in my assessment, to try very hard to be measured and balanced in his or her approach. Some people made observations in lay terms, and I've put those together at times in psychiatric language, but I can refer to the words and explanations should the court so require.
You said the actual words.
The actual words, yes. My lady, it's very important for me to pause at this point, because I really approach this matter in a totally, it is hugely important when one goes in as an expert in a case of this type, to go with a totally open mind, with no preconceived ideas, to try to hear everything, because the information can only have any psychiatric credibility if one approaches it in that way. And I approach it with the absolute certain knowledge that it is not for me to decide. That is 100% the court's role. It is only for me to express a psychiatric opinion with the information that I've gathered. The more information I have, the more I try to put that into a psychiatric opinion, and that is subject to change. So it always has to be subject to change, because it's like with medical students, if you write an answer that's 90% right, but then you kill the patient, you still kill the patient. If there can be one piece of information that changes things, and as an expert, I have to constantly keep that in mind in the entire way of approaching this.
Just stop right there.
Yes.
You have set out at 3.1 till 3.10 those whom you've consulted. Am I right?
Yes.
How did you obtain? How were you informed, and to who to consult to gather information from?
Okay. I asked, what I did is I asked the legal team of Mr. Rohde at the time. I said I want to speak to as many people as possible that would have known, particularly professional people. I wanted to know if there were any people that had been involved in Mrs. Rohde's care, consultation, anybody that could provide information. I do get to it, but maybe I can explain it now to you, to answer the court. I particularly wanted to speak to Mrs. Rohde's family, and I particularly wanted to speak to her friends. And I approached both. And in fact, her friends agreed to speak to me, 4 of them, first. And then I will explain what happened just now, but essentially what happened is a newspaper article put forward some of, I think it was Dr. Perumal's findings, and they were very sensationalized in the media. And her friends didn't give me a reason as to why they didn't want to speak to me after that, but one of the people I spoke to, who's married to one of those friends, said that it was for that reason. Now that was just his opinion, and I accept that, but the consequence was that I couldn't speak to them. I did say that I was available, and in relation to Mrs. Rohde's family, I also asked the legal team to please write to them that should they change their mind and they wish to speak to me, I would always have my door open.
So the sources of information became polarized.
No, they actually weren't polarized, my lady.
Once they became polarized, but they became polarized as to whether they would wish to engage with you or not. Well, they withdrew. Some of them didn't want to engage you.
Yes, I think that Mrs. Rohde's family, I don't think ever did, if that makes sense. I think that they, I can understand that. I could understand their grief and their immense pain, and I could totally understand why they would not want to do that. Don't think I would want to. And as a consequence, I was very mindful. I was present in court when Mrs. Rohde's psychologist, the marriage counsellor, and the general practitioner were here. And I also have read Mr. Holmes's testimony, her brother. And I've tried to do that. And in relationship to the friends, the 3 that I mentioned, all of them had known the deceased for a very long time.
I see they're friends of both Mr. and Mrs. Rohde.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And my lady, in that regard, I also, one of the reasons why I wanted to be particularly mindful of the record and the court process is because I wanted to hear if there was any evidence led about anything that I was not able to gather that would be led by the state with regard to what maybe her family or friends might have said that I had maybe not heard for the reasons that I've explained.
Thank you.
Am I on, I think I'm on 3.12.
3.12.
Thank you. Okay. All the healthcare professionals interviewed were asked to read my notes and to make any changes they felt necessary in order to reflect our discussions correctly. Each of them was also requested to sign at the end of the relevant notes made by me that they constituted an accurate reflection of our discussion. It is important to note that this was in no way to make the notes a form of statement, but rather that it reflected that it's been my growing experiences that cases take time, memories fade, and often a very simple method to try to discredit an expert is to claim that the information on which they base their findings is biased or in fact untrue representation of the discussions or interviews held. In fact, already in this case, much has been said about an aspect of my notes in one particular such interview, and I shall deal with that in the course of my oral evidence. My lady, I've learned, unfortunately, through my experience, that my notes, the subject of my notes, is obviously a very important aspect of that on which I base my psychiatric conclusions. I've also been astonished sometimes at how an interaction can be remembered by two people. And I'm quite a meticulous note keeper. And so what happened when I interviewed the three professional people, I think it's three, is that each one of them actually expressed to me quite an intense fear of coming to court. All of them commented on another high-profile matter, and they were very anxious about that. I said to them, they actually said to me, could I guarantee that they wouldn't be what I said? It's completely out of my hands. I have no role in that whatsoever. I said to them, and I'm not here in any way to trick you or to do anything. But in light of the fact that I may rely heavily, I will rely heavily on what each of you say, it is important that I know, that you know, that we've spoken about the same thing, and that it is actually my attempt to be entirely transparent, honorable, and completely fair. If there's anything in these notes that you disagree with, that you think don't adequately reflect the tone or the take-home message, if I can put it that way, or the content or the details, please change it. We'll change it together. And then at the bottom, could you just sign that this is actually what happened? This is what we spoke about. All of them were very happy to do that. I think it was in some ways a relief that I wasn't, writing something that they didn't know. When I read, to illustrate this point, when I read the statement that was put in, I can't remember exactly when it was put in, but of Mrs. Carol Nader, the marriage counselor. I read the statement, it was very familiar to me because it was what we spoke about. And at the end, there was a paragraph that said, Dr. Panieri-Peter asked me to change my notes, and I changed it in the following way. I can't remember exactly the wording, my lady. I confess that I actually had like a moment of, just took my breath away a little bit. I was like, did that happen? Did it happen like that? And I immediately went to my notes to check through them, thinking, I remember that she changed something, and I actually couldn't remember what it was that she changed, because I thought that I had a very clear understanding about what the content and message of what she said was. And when I went to see it, what I've got crossed off in the notes was different to what she recalled. And I don't mind that. I was amazingly impressed by marriage counselor. I thought she was warm, wonderful, intelligent, and so insightful. I had no criticism of her at any level. And at no point was I in any way trying to trick her, make a statement, or do anything. Simply the change that she's marked just wasn't as she remembered it, and it wasn't as I remembered it. But it didn't make any material difference whatsoever into how I remembered what she said. What she said in her statement is that I'd said she said Mrs. Rohde was a suicide risk, and what she said she wanted to say was Mrs. Rohde might have been a suicide risk. And I understood her from all our interactions to always say that Mrs. Rohde might have been a suicide risk, and I didn't expect her to make a stronger statement or less than that. I was more interested actually in her observations than in her conclusions. Does that make sense? And So the purpose of asking her to sign was not a trick, it wasn't to make a statement, it wasn't to make it a legally binding document, it was none of those things. It was just so that we were on the same page, as it were.
Dr. Panieri-Peter, do you think we could press on this?
Yes.
So just on that note, since you're speaking about Mrs. Nader, she was a marriage counsellor.
Yes.
To what extent do you, as a forensic psychiatrist,
Yes.
sorry, did I get that
It's
right?
Doesn't
Would
matter.
you be guided, or what value would you give when a marriage counsellor who would be very differently trained and far less inferior to your qualifications, to what extent would you take a diagnosis or view on her part? What value would you attach to that? Because I asked her the question, is she able to diagnose, given her qualifications? And I recall her answer was something to the effect of no. So in our court's view, we might perceive that as being a layperson's conclusion and attach value or more or less value to that. How would you perceive it?
My lady, one of the things I've learned in clinical psychiatry is that I try often to say to patients, please just tell me what you're experiencing in the words and the observations without giving it a conclusion. I'll give you an example. Patients sometimes come in and say, I treat quite a lot of medical people, come in and say, I've got ADHD. That's it. I just need medication for that. If you could just prescribe that, we'll carry on. Okay? Thanks. Can we just rewind and tell me what are the symptoms that you experience? And then we'll talk about the diagnosis. My lady, I think qualifications obviously have a role, especially in terms of what people are legally allowed to diagnose. In other words, can they put their head on a block and say, I'm sure that it is this diagnosis and I stand by that medico-legally. So the marriage counsellor was very meticulous, even in a conversation with me, that legally she didn't have the qualifications, in inverted commas, to make that formal diagnosis. But my experience overwhelmingly is that the observations that people make, the intuitions and observations that people make, sometimes ranging from lay people. In her case, she's not a lay person. She's a very experienced marriage counselor. She deals with lots of people in conflict, in marriage situations. And her observations, her assessment of those situations in comparison to other divorcing couples. I mean, 50% of people get divorced. They go to marriage counseling, there's a blow up in the office. She is very well placed to look at those situations in relationship to others. It's true that she is not in a position to make a complex psychiatric diagnosis, but her observations, my lady, I took very seriously because I was very impressed with her capacity to observe as well as her capacity to reflect on her own observations. She's a very humble and very observant person.
Thank you.
While we're at this point, maybe we can just pause because it might be useful just to get on record and very briefly, just for the record, the difference between a specialist psychiatrist, a specialist forensic psychiatrist, a clinical psychologist, and a marriage guidance counselor in terms of training experience and qualifications and legal rights and powers.
I certainly can talk about mine. I will try and give an overview on the others.
Right.
So, a psychiatrist is a person who is a medical doctor and who then has a speciality, for example, the same as a cardiologist or an orthopedic surgeon. And they really study diseases of the mind and of the brain, both from a range of normal to extremely abnormal, and how those present and how they look. And they can treat them. using different methods, medications and psychotherapies, which are, in lay terms, talking cures. Forensic psychiatrist is a subspecialty of that, so you have to be a psychiatrist first. And then it is really all the things, my lady, that were in my CV, which is essentially to look at how psychiatry and the law interface. And I would say in some ways to translate the grey of medicine into a more legal framework. Medicine can be very grey at times, my lady. So it is where the law and psychiatry interact over a range of civil and criminal matters, as I've explained in my CV. There are very few forensic psychiatrists in this country because it takes time and you also have to have worked in that context, and there are not many forensic units. I think there are 10 in the country. I could be wrong to a number of 1 or 2. Clinical psychology. Lady, there are different types of psychologists. You get educational psychologists and counseling psychologists, clinical psychologists. Maybe there are other subtypes too. And psychology is essentially the study of the normal psychological processes, and as they evolve, as they affect people. And clinical psychology moves more towards the assistance of patients who are suffering from mental illnesses. Ideally, psychiatrists and psychologists work well together. They are able to provide different things. The route to become a psychologist is usually through a form of the study of the social sciences. A BA in psychology, which is then, I think you do an honors degree and a master's degree in clinical psychology, or in educational or counseling psychology. I think that, does that answer the question?
Is a psychologist, in particular clinical psychologist, legally entitled to prescribe medications?
No, because they're not a doctor.
Okay, whereas a psychiatrist is.
Yes.
And a marriage guidance counsellor, is she able to, let me just go back. A clinical psychologist can, of course, diagnose mental pathologies such as depression, not so.
Yes.
A marriage guidance counsellor can't legally diagnose those conditions, and also cannot legally prescribe medications. Am I correct?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Let's press on.
Yes.
We are on paragraph 3.13.
Key issues assessed as part of the psychiatric assessment of Mr. Rohde and retrospective post-mortem analysis of that of Mrs. Rohde included information about, inter alia, their family history, medical and surgical history, forensic history, personal and developmental history, educational and occupational history, substance and addiction history, relationship history, psychological and psychiatric history, medication history, and the history of psychiatric and psychological phenomena. It is important to note that at the time of my initial assessments of all of the informants, including Mr. Rohde, namely the September 2016, no pathology or autopsy report from the state had as yet been made available. The aforementioned report was withheld during the bail application hearing and was only presented to the legal team of the defense approximately 7 months after Mr. Rohde's arrest. It is also important to note that considerable inflammatory information had been written in the press by the time I interviewed most of the people, including inter alia an article describing some of the aspects of Dr. Perumal's report, most especially the findings of bruising and rib fractures. My lady, I've already described the impact of that. Written requests were made, and I've already said this, written requests were made to the deceased family and certain of Mrs. Rohde's friends, inviting them to consult with me. They declined to do so. The family friends who were interviewed offered an opinion as to why they thought that this had happened, but this was merely their opinion. Those who declined to be interviewed by me did not provide their reasons for this. It was my hope that I would be able to interview them prior to interviewing other collateral sources, but I could understand their reluctance to participate in this process. I did, however, via the legal representatives, make it clear that should they at any time wish to discuss anything with me that they believe to be important, they would be most welcome to do so. I was present in the court to hear the entire testimony of Ms. Jane Newcomb, psychologist Mrs. Rohde, Mrs. Carol Nader, marriage counsellor, Dr. Steenkamp, general practitioner. Extensive documentation has been perused by me. Do I need to go through them?
Yes, please.
Including, but not limited to, inter alia. Post-mortem report of Dr. Khan, specialist forensic pathologist. Post-mortem report of Dr. Perumal, specialist forensic pathologist. Statement of Dr. Abrams, specialist forensic pathologist. The SAPS docket, extensive WhatsApp communication. Statement of Megan Lee Finnis. Statement of Ryan Anthony Rodder. Various newspaper and magazine articles. Susan Rohde's Facebook and one of her daughter's Facebook. Susan Rohde's 2016 diary at her home, not the diary referred to in the court transcript. Report of Mrs. Jane Newcomb, Mrs. Rohde's clinical psychologist. Report of Mrs. Carol Nader, marriage counsellor. Notes of Dr. Steenkamp, general practitioner. Court transcript, in particular, the evidence of Mr. Thompson, friend of the family, Mr. Mark Holmes, Mr. Daniels, employee at Spear, Mrs. Jane Newcomb, Mrs. Carol Nader, Dr. Steenkamp, Mr. Jason Rohde as available. The sudden death of a loved person in a community causes shock and horror in those around them. Family, friends, and other members in the community, including family members, friends, and other members in the community. Death by suicide is well described in the psychiatric literature to cause a range of emotions in loved ones beyond the normal grief of bereavement. My lady, there are lots of articles about that. If the court wants them, I can provide them, but they're not in the bundle. Death by homicide carries different but also extremely painful emotions. The community around Mrs. Rohde was first confronted by the news of suicide. Soon thereafter, various rumors began in the community, and then Mr. Rohde was arrested. A deluge of media speculation and sensationalism followed, and family and community faced the possibility of a homicide. The community and family of Mr. Rohde and Mrs. Rohde have been emotionally spoiled and traumatized by these events. People are angry, grieving, confused, and bewildered. The sensationalism of the matter has gathered momentum. Comparisons were made at the time with comments such as another death in a bathroom, and the story has elements of scandal, secrets, lies, and death. There's speculation and anger, and a number of the people I interviewed expressed that there's an opinion in their community which is as follows. It does not matter if, I'm quoting my, it does not matter if Jason killed Susan directly or not, because we all know that whatever happened that night, the reason she died was because he was having an affair. My lady, this came across overwhelmingly in the interviews that I had. These sentiments are echoed in the comments online that follow the news coverage, and this assessment has been to try to look past the drama and the confusion and to distill out the key aspects that may be of relevance from a psychiatric perspective to the court in this matter. It is ultimately the responsibility and prerogative of the court to make the conclusion of suicide and homicide based on all the information at its disposal. No opinion or conclusion herein is intended at any stage to attempt to usurp the aforesaid role or function of the court, but merely to look at the issues within the scope of my psychiatric knowledge, training, skill, and experience in light of medically and psychiatrically justifiable reasons. They are simply my professional opinions, observations, and conclusions, and are subject to the court's discretion and conclusion in the light of the totality of the information at its disposal. I request that special consideration be given to aspects of the psychiatric testimony in order to protect the privacy and dignity of the deceased, her family and her children, and third parties. The findings and opinions arrived at by me, pursuant to my evaluation and assessment, are independent of influences whatsoever by any person. At no point prior to the assessment were Mr. or Mrs. Rohde or any of their family members known personally to me. The summary has been compiled on the basis of all the information I've had at my disposal, and I reserve the right to revise my conclusions should any information or evidence come to light that differs from what I've been able to assess, and which in doing so may have an effect on my views.
Thank you. My lady, just be an opportune moment to take a short break. And then
No, it's not. But would you like a break?
I'm sorry, thought it was about 11. No, I'm happy to
I think we
press
can
on.
proceed for a while.
I'm a bit worried about time. It's nearly 11 and we're only on page 6. But on the other hand, I don't want to rush Dr. Panieri-Peter unduly. Right, Doctor, carry on with the heading, Susan Rohde, please.
My lady, before I get to that heading, I think maybe if I can contextualize this following section of information, because I think that might be helpful.
You may.
So I think if I can try and give sort of 3 subsections mentally for this information. The first is to look at Susan Rohde before she found out her husband was having an affair. The second part is the February to June or July 2016. And then there's the build-up to Spear. So there are kind of 3 subsections, if one can look at it that way. The reason and the relevance psychiatrically of the time before is to look at the importance of, I'm going to use the term psychiatric vulnerability. Each of us, my lady, when we present to any crisis, at any point in our life, we bring with it to that crisis, we bring ourselves to that crisis. We bring ourselves. And each of us carries a combination of genetic risk. And by that I don't necessarily mean what runs in one's family, I mean just what one's DNA is. One's personality, one's early life experiences, traumatic experiences that affect you, and all the factors, the myriad of individual factors that come to form who you are, that presents to the crisis that you find yourself in. Because we know in psychiatry that those things sometimes determine the manner in which that crisis may psychiatrically present. Not will, but may. And as a psychiatrist, it helps us understand how best to treat that, because what looks like one thing in one person, based on their vulnerabilities, may require a slightly different treatment. And I'm going to spend quite a lot of time later talking about that. But just to try and give those 3 boxes, if I can put it that way, before I proceed. So under the heading, Family Education, Occupational History, Mrs. Rohde was 47 years old at the time of her death. She married her first serious boyfriend, Jason Rohde, at the age of 24, and the couple had 3 daughters. Collateral information was consistent that there was a significant change in her appearance and behavior in the months prior to her death. Mrs. Rohde was one of 3 siblings, born to a family that outwardly was considered to be successful, upstanding, and achievement-orientated. She had been very involved in her extended family, particularly until her sister and parents moved to the Cape. Collateral indicated that it was a family in which high standards were expected of each other, and important collateral indicated that revealing personal difficulty, especially of a seemingly shameful nature, would be unlikely. My lady, that was very much spoken about by the eldest daughter. And others, but particularly, and confirmed by the marriage counsellor. And in fact, Mrs. Newcomb. Although Mrs. Rohde had a very successful schooling at Bryanston High, she moved to the United States with her parents at the end of grade 11, and this was difficult. She started a year at college in the United States, but returned to South Africa where she met her husband-to-be while on a holiday. She decided to remain there and attended beauty school where she graduated top of her class. The couple married in December 1993 and then moved to Australia to join her parents and siblings. In Australia, Mrs. Rohde worked in an administration office, and later in 1996, when they returned to South Africa, she helped her husband establish a property portfolio. She would renovate these properties and manage the interior design. After her children had been born, she was a stay-at-home mom doing occasional volunteer work. Later, she studied a Bachelor of Arts degree with a major in psychology via UNISA, and worked for a few years as a primary school teacher while her children were in primary school. She struggled with the demands of parenting and working and chose to stay home. At the time of her death, Mrs. Rohde was not working. One of her daughters was at boarding school. I'm not going to read the end of that part. And the other was due to start boarding school immediately after the July holiday. Her eldest daughter was in her final year at school and due to start at the university the following year.
and there was some discussion about her relocating and moving schools earlier and attending another boarding school in Cape Town. My lady, you'll notice I've left 1 or 2 words out just so that they're not identified.
That's fine.
So, to summarize that paragraph, she was facing the empty nest. Mrs. Rohde was a very talented athlete. She had been training for the Comrades Marathon but was injured in April 2015 and was unable to participate. She attended gym very regularly and could run 21 kilometers in an hour and 40 minutes. She was interested in house decor and interior design. She liked to read and was a member of a book club. She spent considerable time and energy invested in the extramural activities of her children. She was not considered to be a religious person, although she attended church on Easter and Christmas. Medical and substance history. Mrs. Rohde was a physically strong and active person with few medical illnesses of significance. She underwent infertility treatment in order to conceive her children. She had surgery, minor surgery, my lady, I'm also not going to read that out, and she underwent 2 cesarean sections.
You can read that out. I don't think that's a problem.
Okay. For a benign breast lump, and she underwent 2 cesarean sections. She suffered gestational hypertension, so it's hypertension in pregnancy, and her babies were born prematurely as a consequence. She attended a general practitioner for medical issues as well as Botox. There's some question as to whether she had a history of seizures or not. It's noted in the psychology notes. I wasn't able to confirm it, which is why I put it there as a question, my lady. She's reported to have a learning disorder which is not defined. She was, to quote her, thought to have leukemia as a child, and she was reported by her daughter to bruise exceptionally easily. When asked of her daughter if she'd ever seen any signs that her father may have hit her mother, such as bruises on her mother's face, she denied that she'd ever seen bruises on her face, but she added, "She'd bruise like an apple. If we fought over a phone, she would get a bruise. She would claim she and her sisters hurt her and bruised her even though we didn't. Even if we tickled her, she would have had a bruise." My lady, it seems that this is a genetic situation. And then again, this is also something I don't know how one stops it being spoken of, but her daughter has the same difficulty, and in recent hospitalization was seen to also have had that problem very, very openly. So it clearly is something, it's common, it can run in families. She was a non-smoker and in fact was against smoking for most of her life. Friends expressed shock that she had started to smoke in the months before her death. And there's a photograph of her on the day of her death posing with a cigarette. And this is considered
on the day before her death.
Sorry, on the day before her death. And this was considered to be most out of character. She drank alcohol on social occasions, despite a strict upbringing regarding alcohol in the months before her death. She drank more, and her attitude towards her daughter's drinking seemed to be more permissive. WhatsApp communications between her daughter and herself in the days before her death referred. My lady, her daughter showed me a number of WhatsApps that they'd had about this. I don't think it's relevant to discuss it in great detail, other than to say that it was clear from those WhatsApps, and I can describe them more if the court would like, that Mrs. Rohde was more permissive than her parents had been about alcohol, and that she had a little bit of a disagreement with her mother about her daughter drinking, and that it was very obvious from the discussion. There is no known history of recreational drug use, although she did attend Africa Burn for the first time in the months before her death. Her blood alcohol level in respect of the specimen taken at autopsy was 0.05 milligrams per litre. She did not have any forensic history. When we get to the psychiatry history, I think I've explained, my lady, the importance of that as it affects a crisis and how somebody presents their vulnerability. Now, my lady, one of the things that I want to stress about the psychiatric history is that from the outset I've been extremely aware of not relying on information given to me by the accused in relationship to his wife. Obviously, it is quite possible that what he told me might not be true, given the circumstances in which he currently finds himself. So in order for me to have done a psychiatric assessment, I have tried, and I will specify if there's anything here that was only told to me by him, because everything else that I put down in terms of psychiatric history has actually been told to me by other people, not him. They might have been confirmed by him or mentioned by him, but they are specifically confirmed by other people. So I've tried to be very, very mindful that is the case. Oh, my lady, there's another thing which I just noticed. Under psychiatric history, it says 24, and then it goes to 28.1. The problem is my glasses situation. My
can
vision is
identify.
getting worse by the day. I'm sorry, my lady.
Right, and we just resolve that in the following way. There was obviously a typographical glitch here, and if we number the paragraph mark 24 as 28, then everything flows from that, and then there will be no paragraph 24, 25, 26, or 27.
Okay.
Is that in order?
Yes, that's in order.
Right.
She, that's Mrs. Rohde, was a perfectionist who was meticulous, competitive by nature, and very concerned regarding the appearance of herself, her home, and her daughters. Some collateral suggested that she could be bossy and controlling of her husband. The words neurotic and regimented were used, and it was thought that she had many rules. She lived by a calendar and was not considered spontaneous. She was thought to be aware of social hierarchy and was seen to have different groupings of friends as a consequence. She could be very funny. She was kind, generous, and outgoing. She was a very busy, on-the-go person who was very active, even when she was on holiday. She was considered to have very high levels of energy and could study late into the night and early in the mornings, and she liked to run long distances. She had times when she could be very talkative. She had long-standing difficulties with sleep. She was known to have issues with food and her weight. She has always been preoccupied with being thin. She did not like to cook. She watched what she ate carefully, and she was concerned about what her daughters ate. Her issues with food intensified dramatically in the months prior to her death. Although no diagnosis of postnatal depression was formally made, others commented that she was paranoid, hypervigilant, and overprotective of her firstborn child in a manner that was considered to be out of the ordinary. My lady, the importance of looking at postnatal mental state is that it is sometimes in retrospect, obviously in its extreme form, when it is diagnosed and goes to a hospital, it is obvious. But subtle changes of mental state, notwithstanding that most women have some subtle changes of mental state, which are normal, they can show an underlying vulnerability to the development of particular mood disorders. So in psychiatry, we always pause to ask a little bit about how people were after their babies were born. And my lady, I've had children. And so I take it as everyone who has had a baby for the first time struggles with that transition. Makes work look easy. So I try very hard to distill out what we all experience to what may be a little bit more than that. So an example was that, so the people who I asked this to, I asked them the question when I asked about how she was after her babies. I said, how was she compared with other women in that situation, to see if there was any difference. An example that was given to me by a friend was that they had 2 Jack Russell dogs that were given away shortly after the eldest child was born, in case they licked the baby. And she became excessively concerned with germs and who was permitted to hold the baby in a way that was considered maybe to be out of keeping with other young mothers. My lady, I just put it there. I haven't drawn a great inference from it, but it was there. I was unable to obtain a reliable history regarding mental illness or suicide in Mrs. Rohde's family of origin. My lady, this paragraph I'm particularly concerned about in relationship to other people. I would like to discuss it with the court. I don't know, do I need to?
It's fine, you can carry on. If I need to explore that, I can call the court in camera, but you can proceed.
Okay. So
it's in the report and I've noted it.
Okay, there's one part that's not in the report. So the information that is here is absolutely confirmed by other sources. There's one piece of information that I obtained from Mr. Rohde, which he did not put it forward spontaneously. Suffice to say, I sort of had to drag it out in different ways. And it's not confirmed, but its presence would be psychiatrically significant. And I'm very anxious about it in this forum. So can I say it, and then would you be able to direct people to not, because it is about a third party, my lady, and it's not verified, but it is important potentially.
Let Mr. Van der Spey guide you. He is questioning you.
Yes, thank you. I think for this answer, you must request the media to just block the live streaming. It will only be for a minute or two.
Do you have to deal with it now?
Would this be a convenient time for us to take a short adjournment?
Perhaps we can, and then we can block that, and you can just discuss that with your learned opponent.
Thank you, my lady.
Thank you.